Welcome back. In this video, we will briefly consider the idea that violence in cinema is quite often sanitized. For simplicity, I will restrict my attention here to violent American films. What is the sanitization of violence in film? Importantly, a film may depict graphic violence while at the same time sanitizing violence. It may sound odd to say that American films tend to sanitize violence, given that so many of our films tend to be extremely graphically violent. But even though graphic portrayals of violence are common, one of the key ways in which such sanitization occurs in American films is through unrealistic depictions of violence. To understand this, let's consider that violence in film has two components. First, the depicted behavior, the sorts of violent acts represented in films. Murder, war, torture, assault, etc. have been depicted in some manner throughout cinema's history. There have not been many changes here over the years. While some of the violent situations in films are unrealistic, or simply fantastical, it may be incorrect to say that the types of violent acts depicted in films tend to be more unrealistic than not. Regardless, it should be noted that the frequency with which certain violent acts are depicted is unrealistic. That is, Hollywood may have a tendency to depict certain violent acts more often than the actual rate of occurrence of those acts in real life. For instance, 2/3 of the annual gun deaths in the United States are suicides. Yet, this cannot be said of most gun deaths in films. Second, the stylistic means, the manner in which violence is portrayed. The changes have been dramatic here, even depicting violence in a sympathetic manner. It is primarily in regard to the stylistic means utilized by filmmakers that we say violence is unrealistic. So the artistic depiction of movie violence tends to be unrealistic in two ways. First, although pervasive in narrative film, it is still at the end of the day fictitious. Consider how we suppress actual images of violence and carnage far more than we do these fictional depictions. For example, President George W. Bush's administration banned news outlets from showing even the coffins of fallen service members returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't sit around and watch hours of raw footage from war zones on the nightly news, though we spend innumerable hours taking in fictitious acts of violence in film. Thus, because most of the violence the majority of us witness is fiction, our visual frame of reference is skewed. Second, action has a privileged status in film. It occurs as a spectacle. There's often a build-up to a dramatic explosion of violence. Violence is often exciting, fun, and glorious to witness. Killing and maiming others is presented in a beautiful manner. Sanitized violence can influence people to think of violence as fun, useful, necessary, and even paradoxically, harmless. To make matters even more complicated, the party inflicting violence in film may be depicted as just or righteous in their cause. Consider the revenge flick category. Films such as Kill Bill Volume 1. The writers and directors of revenge flicks could seek to justify the violence inflicted on certain characters by making the recipients of violence bad guys, or somehow deserving it. If those treated with violence have it coming to them, then the violence may be thought of as justified or even good. Simply put, the more evil a character is or their actions are, the more violence they deserve, and the degree or type of violence due is justified in proportion to the character's deserts. However, how does this look on screen? Consider director Quentin Tarantino, who seems guilty of using this sort of justification as a cheap excuse to depict extreme violence. In his films, Tarantino butchers Southern slave owners, Nazis, even Hitler himself, gangsters, drug dealers, murderers, etc. When one takes an honest look at the entire catalog of Tarantino films, it's hard to believe that he as a filmmaker actually cares about social injustice. Rather, he exploits social injustice by using genuine human tragedy and misfortune as the basis for grisly and bloodthirsty entertainment. This seems very different than the violence in a war film like Platoon or Saving Private Ryan, which is meant to show the audiences the horrors rather than the glory of war. Even if violence in the service of a greater good is justified, there are repercussions for those involved. Too many films seem to depict violence in the service of a greater good as cool, macho, or healthy, as opposed to heartbreaking, tragic, or traumatic. In violent American cinema, especially hyper-violent tokens, of which there are many, there is rarely any attempt made to depict the aftermath of violence in a way that is true to life.